There have been many examples in history of a place being divided by multiple countries. Famously, you have the partitions of Poland, the scramble for Africa, or the Allied occupation zones of Germany and Austria after World War II. But sometimes this is done over much smaller areas of land. Within the Allied occupation zones of Germany and Austria, Berlin and Vienna were also divided into 4 zones. But for this video, we're going to learn about an even tinier division. For just over 80 years, the city of Tianjin in China was divided between China and foreign nations. At times, there were 2 foreign nations there, at others as many as 9, each controlling at most a square kilometer or 2. What was even weirder, though, was that they weren't technically colonial territories despite acting like them, and the legal situation was even more complicated. Why was this Chinese city divided between so many countries, and how did this weird situation even work? The answer, of course, starts with empire, but we'll get into more details on this weird colonial hub right after a special word from this video's sponsor. With so many people these days reliant on the internet for looking up random tidbits of knowledge, one of the things that's become a sort of lost art is the general guidebook. However, this video's sponsor Hungry Minds is bringing that back and taking it to the next level with their book, or rather, the book. The book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, is like a history and science guidebook combined, containing over 400 pages worth of knowledge ranging from how X-rays work to avoiding poisonous plants to the basics of chess. Essentially a basic guide for so many areas of human civilization. While the texts of knowledge make it a great book for your shelf, the absolutely beautiful handmade illustrations make this an amazing book for your coffee table as well. This book, the book, was the result of a huge Indiegogo and Kickstarter campaign, and with that support, they were able to not only make this beautiful book a reality, but consult experts for the information inside and print these illustrations on high-quality matte paper and inside a stunningly illustrated cover. With hundreds of thousands of copies sold already and great reviews, this book, the book, is a great gift to give someone. Or to buy for yourself. I mean, I certainly want to keep this book. I can learn how to make a water alarm clock. Buy a copy of the book with the link below using the promo code EMPEROR10 and you'll be on your way. You may not be able to put everything that it means to be human or part of a civilization into a single book, but this book is a great start. So thanks to Hungry Minds for sponsoring this video. During the age of colonial imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there were few places Europe didn't colonize, and even in places they didn't take over, they certainly tried. Their now industrialized economies resulted in many consequences for their countries and the world. But there were 2 main consequences that drove their desire for colonies specifically. A rich economy grows from making more and selling more goods. So firstly, their economies needed to be fueled by more resources than their home countries often had, so guaranteeing their access to such resources became more important. Britain was able to jumpstart their industrialization earlier than others, partially because of how much coal and iron their island nation had to begin with. But the British Isles only held so much, and they couldn't always keep up with rising demand, so they had to expand. Secondly, the more people you can sell goods to, the more money you can make. Since every other Western country has their own industries that you need to compete with, if you really wanted to make a lot of money, find an area that doesn't have the stuff that you sell and add them to your market. While both of these reasons fueled colonial expansion, some areas leaned more towards one purpose than another. Africa, for example, was certainly used to sell goods to, but most of it was taken over primarily for resources like rubber, ivory, diamonds, and so on. However, one area of the world that was all about the marketing was China. Africa was divided into thousands of complex political entities, and like the classic saying goes, divide and conquer. The Qing dynasty of China, however, was a single empire the size of Europe. You could absolutely stoke divisions in China, like supporting one of its many uprisings, but you weren't going to be able to fully conquer it like Africa. China's massive population, of course, made it the gem of markets. However, at first China was self-sufficient and insular, to where they didn't really care about anything Europe could offer. As a result, much of the 19th century involved Europe and America forcing their way in economically and militarily. To guarantee markets to sell their goods, each major power had different areas of China they wanted to focus on, and as a result, rather than outright colonies, there would be spheres of influence. China would object to Western meddling many times, but unfortunately the wars that would follow would not go very well for them, and then Europe would just force even more concessions. To help maintain a presence there, a few European powers demanded leased territories. A small territory around a port city would be given to a European power, usually in a lease for 99 years. The Europeans would make this leased territory their base of operations essentially, keeping a naval fleet there and a small set of forces there, just in case China tried to stand up to them again. This situation was so bad for China that the era between the First Opium War in 1839 and the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949 is labeled as the Century of Humiliation. What about Tianjin though? Tianjin, or Tientsin as it was called at the turn of the 20th century, was one of the most valuable ports in all of China. On top of that, it was a short distance from the capital of Beijing. In 1858, the Treaty of Tientsin was signed, which is a name given to multiple agreements between China and the British, French, Americans, and Russians. Once these were ratified by the Chinese in 1860, Britain and France were granted concessions in Tianjin. The United States, meanwhile, was given a concession by China for consistency's sake in 1860, but America didn't establish themselves right away and was soon busy with the American Civil War. So there was this weird situation where there was never any legal recognition of this concession by America itself. China was too worried about potential retaliation to take it back themselves, so this area was in a weird limbo for nearly half a decade before America started kind of acknowledging it diplomatically, but even then they barely did anything with it. Russia, meanwhile, wasn't given a concession zone yet, but don't worry, they'll be back later. Tianjin wasn't the only Chinese city with European concessions, but it by far would grow to have the most. The differences between a concession, a leased territory, and a colony were all rather fuzzy, but ultimately these concessions in Tianjin were areas controlled by foreign powers and subject to its own set of laws. So the differences were largely negligible from a colony. Depending on which concession zone in question, maybe the European laws only applied to the Europeans living there and not the Chinese, or maybe it applied to both. To make things more confusing, because you had different sets of laws in each zone, many criminals would do a crime in one zone and then just temporarily escape to another zone for temporary safety. You can already probably imagine what a legal nightmare this was. In 1895, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. Originally, they were going to demand the Liaodong Peninsula, but the European nations of Russia, Germany, and France strong-armed Japan into abandoning that claim. Germany then demanded a concession in Tianjin as a reward. Of course, Japan would still interfere in China and acquire their own concession in Tianjin as well in 1898 anyway. But Tianjin would get even more crowded thanks to the Boxer Rebellion, which was an 1899 anti-Western uprising in northern China, hoping to drive the Europeans out. The Qing dynasty decided to support them, but this resulted in the formation of the Eight-Nation Alliance between European powers, Japan, and the United States. This alliance sent an expedition to northern China and defeated the Boxers by 1901, and China was punished again by basically giving more concessions. Most of the nations that already had concessions had their holds expanded, while the others were given new concessions all their own. Between 1900 and 1902, concessions were given to Russia, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. The United States, meanwhile, decided to settle their ambiguous status by giving their concession zone to the British zone in 1902, but they still left a small military garrison there. So now Tianjin was divided between China and 8 other nations. In 1911, the Qing dynasty was overthrown and the Chinese Republic was established. However, the concessions in Tianjin were still there to stay. The first shakeup would be shortly after during World War I. Germany's leased territory of Qingdao was seized by Allied forces in 1914 after a brief siege, but the concessions in Tianjin were temporarily safe, being surrounded by a neutral China. But in 1917, China joined the Allies and took the opportunity to seize the German and Austro-Hungarian zones. China's reacquisition of these zones would be confirmed at the end of World War I with the various peace treaties. In 1920, China also took advantage of the ongoing Russian Civil War to seize the Russian concession zone. Once the Soviet Union was established in 1922, it didn't take long for them to ultimately let China keep their former zone in 1924. Belgium, meanwhile, was actually finding their concession zone more of a hassle than a benefit, so in 1929 they signed an agreement with China to return their zone, and in 1931 it was finally handed back officially. In 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out, and soon Japan was occupying everything in the area except for the remaining concession zones for the time being. These now isolated concession zones, both in Tianjin and elsewhere like in Shanghai, would sometimes work as temporary hubs of refuge for those fleeing Japanese atrocities, but not in any long-term sense. In 1939, there was a brief diplomatic incident involving Japanese forces blockading the British and French zones with barriers like barbed wire to prevent people from crossing over. The incident would be resolved by the British and Americans threatening to economically cut off Japan from goods and supplies like scrap metal. Japan agreed to remove the blockades in exchange for the British and French no longer interfering in Japanese affairs in the area. The economic threats worked for now, but eventually they would be cut off from their supplies of scrap metal and oil, and it would cause Japan to enter World War II just 2 years later in 1941. Japan then naturally just took over the British zone in late 1941. France's zone was left alone due to Japan's neutrality with the Vichy French regime. In 1943, once Italy dropped out of World War II, the Nazi puppet government in northern Italy agreed to give Japan the Italian zone. Meanwhile, to show solidarity with China now that they were both fighting the same enemy, the British agreed to give up their claim to their concession zone in Tianjin in 1943 and would allow China to retake it back once they could. With World War II over in 1945, Japan of course lost their concession zone to China. In 1946, France then agreed to give up their concession zone to China, being the last one left. In fact, by 1946, only Portuguese Macau and British Hong Kong remained in European hands in China at all, and the concession system was finally over. Hong Kong, of course, was eventually returned in 1997 once the 99-year lease was up, and then Macau would be returned in 1999. Overall, it's kind of insane that there was this much demand and division in such a small amount of territory. Most historical world maps don't even show the Tianjin concessions because they're too small to show up at actual size to begin with. In a way, it's quite an apt metaphor for how much more complex political situations in history often really were, but still fascinating nonetheless. I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.